There we go.
Well done.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Sorry, I'm just dealing with the tech.
We'll keep on meeting people. We'll wait maybe a minute or two, and then we can get started. Well, 02. Maybe we can get started, and Kat will continue to admit people as they come along. So, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all. So, welcome to the fourth event of our webinar series on LGBTQ plus in the life course, which is organized by King's College Health and Social Care Workforce Research Unit at the Policy Institute. And Kat is, of course, with us. So thanks, Kat, for organizing this. And UCL's Division of Primary Care and Population Health. So far, we've had 3 great and thought-provoking sessions so far, and we're confident that you will also enjoy today's session. So today is all about experiences of LGBTQ plus adults in the prison system. We have 2 excellent speakers, and they will present their work looking at findings from 2 projects, exploring the experiences and needs of this population in the prison setting. So our first presenter is Dr. Kayleigh Charlton, Research Associate at Children and Young People Center for Justice. Kayleigh will present LGBTQ plus pains of imprisonment, a letter writing study. So this presentation will explore some of the findings from a small letter writing study with LGBTQ plus prisoners in the UK. And our second presenter is Sally Evans, a chartered and registered forensic psychologist. Sally will present on the lived experience of trans and gender diverse prisoners residing in the women's prison estate. Just very quickly, because before we go into the presentations, we are recording the session. So if possible, please mute your mics. We will take questions at the end, so just wait, but feel free to use the chat function at any time, because we will be monitoring the chat and then relay the questions to the presenters at the end. And finally, if you could sign up to our newsletter, we'd appreciate it. A link to sign up was included in the invite that was circulated, but you can also email us and let us know. And if you could spread the word about this seminar series, and also let us know if you got feedback or ideas for new sessions, because we're looking for presenters. So just let us know. Not going to waste any more time. I'm going to mute myself now and leave the floor to Kayleigh.
Hello, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks for having me. I've not quite gotten around to updating my title, but yeah, thanks for that introduction. I only passed my PhD a couple of weeks ago, so it's all very new and fresh still. But yeah, I'm Kayleigh. I'm a research associate at the University of Strathclyde. I'm going to share a little bit of work that I did during my PhD. This was only a very kind of small part of my PhD study. and it's focused on LGBTQ pains of imprisonment, and it's a letter writing study that I'll be talking about today. So I'm going to briefly recap some of the literature around pains of imprisonment by Sykes, and then I'll touch on some of the relevant literature surrounding LGBTQ plus prisoners. I'll then introduce the kind of case study context and method of letter writing, and then I will go through each of the findings. It'll be fairly brief just for time purposes, but yeah, I'd be more than happy to kind of pick up discussions about this at the Q&A at the end as well. Okay. So based on an ethnography of New Jersey State Prison in 1958, Sykes argued that there were 5 fundamental deprivations of daily prison life, known collectively as the pains of imprisonment. So this included the loss of liberty, the loss of goods and services, the loss of heterosexual relationships, the loss of autonomy, and lastly, loss of security. But Sykes supposed that it was the sum total of these deprivations that made prison life unbearable. The pains of imprisonment have since become quite a central analytical lens when writing about the experiences of prisoners, specifically when we're determining the needs and experiences of kind of subgroups or categories of prisoners, if you like. So while Sykes originally identified these 5 pains, they have since been expanded by multiple studies, including the gendered pains of imprisonment written by Ben Crew, the pains of fathers in prisons by Thomas Uglevic, and the pains of elderly men in prison. That is by no means an extensive or exhaustive list of all the different pains that have been explored, but just a little snippet. Until recently, however, there had been nothing written or very little written about the specific pains of LGBTQ prisoners. It wasn't until 2 years ago Matthew Maycock published the first article of which focused on the transgender pains of imprisonment. Matt's work was focused specifically in Scotland and covered both men's and women's prisons, and I can talk a little bit about more of that when I get to the literature section. But yeah, just a brief note as well to say that, you know, I'm only speaking about the women's prison estate because the wider thesis focused on the women's prisons. Historically, also, there's, you know, women's prisons have been overlooked for men's prisons. And finally, it's been estimated that 22% of the women's prison estate identify as LGBTQ, which is quite a large figure in comparison to what is estimated to be 7% in men's prisons. So actually we're talking, although about a small population, about quite a significant number of people that might be experiencing these specific LGBTQ plus pains of imprisonment in women's prisons. Okay, so speaking of the literature, there is by no means a plethora of work, but there is a kind of growing small body of work emerging on LGBTQ plus prison experiences in women's prisons. So in 2016, Nicola Carr wrote a report alongside the Irish Penal Reform Trust, a small section of which highlighted that homophobia and transphobia remain serious problems in the women's prison estate. And this is in contrast to what has kind of previously been said about women's prisons, that they're kind of more understanding or empathetic towards gender and sexual diversity. Carr's work highlights that actually it's still quite a serious problem, and that lesbian and bisexual women face an undercurrent of stigma. Fernandes and colleagues in 2020 at the University of Dundee reveal similar findings in their work across both England and Scotland, which demonstrate a lack of LGBTQ plus specific support and resources, as well as a perceived lack of flexibility in the system, if you like. As I already mentioned, Maycock's work on the transgender pains of imprisonment has been hugely influential in this area. Maycock identified a range of pains specific to the trans population in Scotland, including transphobia and isolation. So he discusses the specific challenges of transition in custody, where participants indicate a much slower and more challenging transition process than they might anticipate on the outside. The process of transition in custody also led to feelings of isolation and added to experiences of discrimination from staff and peers. And finally, he highlights that there was no kind of sense of community felt by the participants because trans prisoners were not all located in the same location. which kind of heightened this feeling of being the only one or being alone. We can also kind of cautiously turn to the North American literature to understand LGBTQ experiences. Primarily, this work is being carried out in men's prisons about trans women's experiences. However, if it's something that you're interested in, I would definitely recommend having a look at Val Genis's work, Laurie Sexton's work. They've both done a significant amount of work. But yeah, I just need to be cautious about kind of drawing parallels from the US experience to a UK experience, perhaps. So speaking of UK specific experiences, I situate much of this work in a particular time and a place. I'm sure many of you are aware if you're kind of broadly interested in these topics, but the political climate in the UK around LGBTQ rights has in recent years deteriorated. More specifically, hate crimes targeting trans people have rocketed in the last 2 years and are on a continued rise. The UK was once ranked, one of the safest nations for LGBTQ people, but as of 2023, the UK is now ranked as 17th out of the 49 European nations. And some sources link this fall in ranking specifically to the ongoing anti-trans rhetoric in the UK, which is undoubtedly kind of had a broader and bigger impact on the LGBTQ plus community. We can also see a shift in discussions around trans prisoners over the last kind of 5 to 10 years. So in 2015, there was a really well-known public case about trans woman Tara Hudson, who was sent to an all-male prison, HMP Bristol. Very quickly after Hudson was placed in Bristol, a petition which garnered over 150,000 signatures was set up to encourage her move back to an all-women's estate. The petition argued that after 6 years of reconstructive surgery and spending her entire adult life as a woman, her placement in an all-male prison was a breach of her human rights and placed her in danger of abuse, sexual violence, and even death. Hudson was eventually transferred to a women's facility. Since that case, however, there's been a campaign, a very high-profile campaign to remove trans women from women's prisons. And the campaign was largely built around the history of sexual violence of one prisoner who was housed in the women's prison estate. As a result of that kind of pressure from this high-profile campaign, the Scottish Prison Service's previously trans-inclusive policy was reversed in January 2023. Therefore, all trans offenders entering the Scottish prison system will first be sent to the prison that matches their sex register at birth rather than their gender identity. So kind of instead of handling this case as a single incident, I suppose the ramifications have been felt more broadly across the prison estate and have led to a lot of discussions, a lot of media attention, and a lot of policy changes in both Scotland and England surrounding the housing of trans prisoners. I just think that's quite important context to situate some of these findings within. So the article or the work that I'm talking about draws on participant writing as an approach. And participant writing is interesting, or letter writing is quite an interesting method in prisons. I think it's often overlooked for in-person interviews. However, I think it can produce really rich and insightful data, as well as allowing people broader access to a prison estate, which can be quite tricky to navigate access with. Participant writing also allows participants to kind of take their time and respond with some level of reflection. They can kind of decide on how they wish to express thoughts or feelings that come up, providing somewhat of an emotional safety zone, so to speak. So participants were recruited through advertisements in a prison newspaper. 2 rounds of advertisements were sent out. The first was a leaflet insert, and that was sent to 12 women's prisons in England. The second was within the newspaper itself, and therefore reached all prisons in the UK. Research packs were sent out to participants who expressed an interest in taking part. Initially, 20 letters of initial interest were received, 6 of which participants were not eligible. 14 research packs were then sent out to those that were eligible, and only 5 of those were returned. So the research pack included a consent form, an information sheet, a question sheet, writing paper, and a pre-stamped envelope to allow participants to write back free of charge. There are lots of interesting and lengthy conversations around the ethical challenges, the emotional challenges of engaging in a method like this, and some of the logistical and practical challenges as well. I wrote a separate methods paper on that I can link to at the end, because I kind of won't have time to talk about all of that. But yeah, it's particularly interesting, and something I'd recommend considering before trying out a method like this, I suppose. Okay, on to some findings. So participants reported experiencing and/or witnessing bullying and discrimination from prison officers, senior management, and diversity and equality teams towards LGBTQ plus prisoners. These reports included a range of microaggressions, such as misgendering someone, not using someone's chosen name, to accounts of quite physical violence. So Benny, a non-binary prisoner housed in a women's prison in Scotland, shared, "Staff were mainly two-faced and refused to call me by my new name." Benny's referring here to the process of changing her name in prison to reflect her non-binary identity. However, staff did not always get this right, or, as Benny suggests, point blank refused to use Benny's chosen name. Other microaggressions were noted. So Rachel, who is cisgender and pansexual, felt that her friendships were more heavily scrutinised because of her sexuality. So officers engaged in inappropriate lines of questioning over the friendships and relationships formed between prisoners. Rachel told me about a friend from a previous prison who was then stopped from progressing to open conditions because of a suspected relationship between the two of them. And that's relevant because Rachel was in the kind of open conditions place that this person could have ended up at. Rachel revealed that their prison offender manager continued to make remarks about the suspected sexuality and the kind of friendship between them, telling her to consider that her friend might only be gay for the stay. Beyond these microaggressions, Benny also candidly wrote about the physical violence they had experienced in prison after being labelled difficult by other prisoners. Benny mentioned that an officer stood by as they were knocked unconscious. Sarah also reveals that her identity as a trans woman was revealed to other prisoners without her consent, which led to her receiving death threats and subsequently being isolated from other prisoners for 30 days in cell confinement conditions. And I think it's also worth highlighting that whilst I've labelled this bullying and discrimination, I think it's quite clear that some of these examples go beyond what we would consider discrimination or bullying. In some cases, these can be considered human rights violations. Okay, so all participants highlighted the lack of LGBTQ specific support in prison or access to resources. So this included little to no in-person support from organisations, as well as a lack of gender-affirming products or resources. Participants describe this as an issue that never seems to get sorted. Sarah reflects on the type of support available to her and the limits of this support. So right now, I only have access to telephone support. The services I use are LGBT Health and Wellbeing and Mindline Transline. Both provide a listening ear, but little else. Crucially to her, there's no organisations that come into prison to support LGBTQ prisoners. I think Scots Trans Alliance did used to go prior to COVID, but that kind of changed during the pandemic and after. Benny touches on another important element of LGBTQ support, which is access to gender-affirming resources and products. For Benny, this inadequate access to products is a source of gender dysphoria. Benny states the prison service is rather anal. Men are provided with boxer shorts and showering gels. Females are provided with bras and lacy bits. Bikini-style knickers, nighties only your gran would wear. There's no thought to people like me who wear boxers because I feel far more comfortable. Catherine, at the bottom, also highlights what's previously been documented in the literature as the financial cost of being trans in prison, and wrote to me multiple times asking for support with services, including kind of access to clothing grants or grants that could help her access gender-affirming products. Okay, and then onto the last theme, uncertainty and belonging. So uncertainty and belonging were issues facing specifically the trans and non-binary participants. Participants spoke about the difficulties engaging with complex case boards, which are meant to help determine whether someone could be housed in the prison that aligns with their gender identity or not. Sarah recalls her complex case board as intrusive. Or in Benny's case, Benny struggled with the fact that there was no non-binary option in the system. So they were either to be recorded as male or female, which didn't align with Benny's identity. Benny also spoke about having to constantly correct staff about their identity. They had a specific problem of being assumed to be a trans man and have been assumed to want access to men's prisons. So there were some difficulties and confusion and uncertainties around how to kind of, how to record Benny's identity. Again, coming back to the situating this in a particular time and a place, this study was conducted on the lead up to and during the change in Scottish policy around trans prisoners. So this meant that Catherine mentions being really scared about how that would then impact her experience in England. And she was awaiting her complex case board, and she could either be shifted to an all-men's prison, HMP Downview Trans Unit, which, for those unfamiliar with, is a kind of very small holding unit of 1 to 6 trans prisoners who are essentially kind of away from the general population of HMP Downview. But otherwise, we kind of don't know much about it, but there's only ever kind of 1 to 3 people, I believe, in this unit, and Catherine was quite concerned about potentially going there or going to the men's jail, or if she could stay in the women's prison. Okay, just to begin wrapping up a little bit then. So this work is kind of tentative, but also is the beginning of identifying perhaps some LGBTQ plus specific pains of imprisonment, which include bullying and discrimination, lack of LGBTQ plus specific support and resources, and uncertainty and belonging. So while these themes kind of broadly mirror Maycock's analysis of trans pains of imprisonment, there are elements of physical violence and human rights violations that weren't evident in his work. And I kind of wonder if that reflects this kind of particular time that I was doing this study or not. We can't know for sure, I suppose, but yeah, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. And as we begin theorizing around LGBTQ plus experiences, I think it's also important that we step back and think, what can we do with this and what can we take away from this? And whilst there's definitely space to argue for better housing policies, updated staff training on LGBTQ issues, peer support networks, and access to gender affirming resources, we kind of have to say this with some element of caution, with the caveat that these things are not straightforward, they're not easy to change or implement, and they certainly don't solve all of the problems that we might expect come with these pains of imprisonment. It's also worth noting that I'm well aware that it's a very small sample size. I'm putting a lot of weight on these people's experiences, and there's definitely more work to be done in this area. I'm starting now that the PhD is over to kind of think about other ways to build around this work and build out from this work, whether that's doing more work with this particular group, or expanding it to men's prisons, or even looking at some secondary data sources such as memoirs, to try and kind of bulk out this theorizing around LGBTQ pains of imprisonments. But yeah, otherwise, that is me, and I'll hand back over and let Sally talk. But thank you, and I look forward to any questions or thoughts.
Thank you so much, Kayleigh. That was great. Sally, do you wanna start your presentation?
I will, yes. I'll just try and share my slides. Has that worked?
Yes, it's working. Perfect.
Perfect. we go to slideshow. Perfect. There we go. So hello, welcome. Thank you for having me this afternoon. So yeah, as said at the beginning, I'm Sally Evans. I'm a forensic psychologist. I spent quite a few years initially working in the prison service, mostly in the male estate, a short period of time in the women's estate. I left there probably about 6 years ago now. So I'm now kind of an independent psychologist. I do risk assessment reports still for people within custody as one of the kind of areas of work that I'm in. I also lecture in forensic psychology at the Queen Mary University in London. And really this kind of this study is part of my doctorate, which I'm currently writing up. And it came about from that work that I was completing with as part of the risk assessments that I do. And I was asked to complete a risk assessment with a trans woman who was located in the male prison estate. And it was the first time I'd knowingly worked with a trans prisoner in the kind of 20 years that I'd worked in the prison. And so thinking, brilliant, I'll go and kind of look at what research is out there to help me identify what's the best risk assessment to use and see kind of what's kind of valid in terms of the tools that we use, and found that there really was very little literature out there at all in terms of our understanding of what work we should do with trans and gender diverse people in prison and what their experiences are like, particularly within England and Wales. And so this feeds on, why is this not moving to the next one? Here we go. Sorry. A lot of this feeds on from what Kayleigh was talking about, so it saves me talking about a lot of the background stuff because it's all linked to the same kind of research really. And as we said, the majority of the research that we have, as Kayleigh said, is done within the USA, and this is also done within California as well, kind of specifically. A lot is based within there. So there's very different prison systems that we're working with. I'm aware of a couple of studies that have been done within the UK. One is Maycox, which was done in Scotland, and then one has been done in England and Wales by Nolte et al. But again, that was conducted in the male estate, so it was looking at the experiences of trans women within the male prison estate. So there's very little research actually that's been done looking at what the experiences are of trans and gender diverse people within the women's prison estate. Then we kind of lack that understanding. We kind of have an understanding for experiences of trans women, but within a male estate, and that's going to be a very different scenario and a very different living situation in terms of linking back kind of what those pains are going to be for them and what those experiences are going to be. Research that has specifically focused on trans men, the only research I could really find was done by Rogers and Rogers. That explored more about someone's journey into offending as well, rather than exclusively their experiences of custody. So it did touch a bit on custody, but it was more about what led people to come into custody. So essentially kind of what we know and what a lot of policies are going to be based on in terms of the prison service within England and Wales is on trans women's experiences within the male prison estate. And a lot of that experience is going to be based within America. So we're really missing an understanding of what it's like for us here, essentially. And this can really, and as well, they're very much spoken about as kind of a homogeneous group as well. Kind of this is the experience of trans women, rather than thinking about many different factors, the kind of very heterogeneous experiences that they have and how that impacts upon those experiences as well. So just to touch a little bit, so some of the research that has been looked at for trans people within prison, and this was done within England and Wales. This was by Bromdale et al. And this came about by being asked to kind of look at how much support was available. So this was commissioned by the NHS and the MOJ in 2019, so a few years old now. But what they found is that trans people in prison are significantly more likely to experience problems than other prison populations, coming about because of actually the many other factors that are going to impact on that as well, and a very complex group and how those intersectionality plays a part there. And they also have quite unique challenges. So they're more likely to be picked up for things like breaches of rules because of potentially their clothing doesn't align with the clothing of the establishment that they're in, wearing makeup, for example, within the male estate, how they're presenting themselves. They're likely to be breaching the rules of the binary prison system that they're placed in. And because kind of individuals are not necessarily going to be in an establishment which aligns with their gender identity. They're going to be aligned, as Kayleigh said, mostly based upon their sexes assigned at birth, and even more so now because those policies have changed. There was a bit more ability a few years ago to put in requests to move to establishments that aligned with their gender identity. But specifically for trans women wanting to go to the women's estate, that's become a lot more difficult over the last couple of years. And the research tells us that individuals who are not in an establishment which aligns with their gender identity are more likely to be at risk of verbal, physical and sexual assault. So they are a very vulnerable group. Healthcare providers, back in 2019, but it was identified that they lacked transgender knowledge. And this could result in prisoners being denied general, mental and gender affirming medical care. And linked into that, trans people within custody were also more likely to have increased levels of depression, anxiety and other mental health concerns and difficulties that they're experiencing. And then you've got that lack of kind of understanding of how to support them from that. So from the research we've got, I kind of identified that there really is a kind of a lack of understanding into the experiences of trans and gender diverse people, particularly within England and Wales, and particularly within the women's estate. So this is then where my research kind of came from, really, of wanting to look at what those experiences were. So I contacted all of the 12 women's prisons within England and Wales. That was a mixture of ones run by HMPPS and then 2 run privately. The 2 private prisons declined to take part in the study at the time, but 8 of the HMPPS prisons agreed that I could contact individuals to try and recruit participants. And from that, I recruited 7 participants who I was able to go in and meet, and I completed semi-structured interviews with those individuals from across 4 different prisons within the women's estate. And those interviews kind of range between about an hour and a half. So they're quite in-depth interviews and a lot of really valuable information that I was able to gain from them about what their experiences have been of custody. So I'll just go through what some of those findings were. Identified 4 kind of main themes, really. So it's a qualitative study, really exploring those experiences. And on each of these themes, I've just got some key quotes that I pulled out which link to it. And I won't read through the quotes, but I'll just explain a bit more around kind of what it meant and what I kind of found from that, excuse me. So the first really key thing was whether the structural support met transgender diverse prisoners' needs. And overall, it kind of felt that it really didn't. The support that was kind of there, the overarching support, or what should come down from kind of MOJ and HMPPS, wasn't really there to meet their needs. A lack of transgender boards was a real common theme. But what was interesting is that at the time that the study was taking part, it was kind of the end of last year into the beginning of this year, is when there was a change in policy within England and Wales. So similar to what Kayleigh was talking about, and changes in Scotland as well. And part of the changes in policy in England and Wales was what was in the new policy was a reduction in the number of transgender boards that people would be eligible for. So in the previous policy, it was much more frequent that trans individuals were welcome to have boards with multidisciplinary teams talking about how they were managing in custody, whether their needs were met, whether they were in a suitable establishment for their needs. And they could happen fairly regularly and be requested when there was kind of a change in circumstances. But that was very much reduced within the new policy in terms of they'd have a board when they arrive, they'd have a board essentially kind of prior to leaving to go into the community, but there wasn't a requirement for regular boards within that. And this really reflected in what the participants were talking about. And it really came across that they weren't aware of that change in policy. They just felt that these boards that they previously had or that they're expecting to have weren't being offered to them. So even from that, the policy changes didn't appear to be being shared with those that were really impacted by them, actually. And they weren't being made aware of what their new kind of entitlements were. Within what they were talking about, they kind of made recommendations of kind of changes to the system as well. So talking about what they think could be made better and how the prisons could be run more effectively. And then I've used those recommendations as part of recommendations which I'm taking forward to present to the prison service, of kind of saying of how I think from experiences there could be kind of further changes in the policies that they've got as well. The second theme, I've lost my little, sorry, my mouse went missing, was looking at whether gender affirmation influenced their well-being. So whether they were able to present as the gender of which they identified, and what impact there was on them of kind of the limitations for that. And a real key thing from this was this example by Max that I've got on here that kind of came out. And in even this, the use of kind of terminology. So there was a real lack of chest binders available for trans men within custody. There seemed to be a policy that one chest binder would be provided initially for anybody kind of that applied for it, and then after that they could buy their own. But pretty much all the trans men that I spoke to talked about how that one that provided wasn't suitable. It was the wrong size, most particularly, or one of them had had theirs stolen from their property and was struggling to get a replacement for that. And so to manage this, Max was kind of resorting to wearing sports bras, which in terms of the support kind of provided what he was looking for. But it was the use of the terminology, and it was the fact that he was having to wear something that was deemed a bra, and that was really impacted upon him and his well-being and how he thought about himself and how he thought about his appearance, for the fact that he had to wear this item that was identified as being a bra and was identified as being for women. And I think that's kind of a really interesting thing that's not necessarily picked up on within these policies and with people that are working with them. And the real difficulty in being able to get hold of items as well within the women's estate. So Robin talks about trying to get hold of male items, and prison governors within the women's estate would have to ring people that they know within the male prison estate to ask if they've got any spare clothing that they can send over that can be used to spare boxers or other clothing and t-shirts. Some prisoners were able to order their own clothing, so they could do that as well. But then these clothes were really sought after by everybody else in the prison. So there'd be cis women that really sought after the kind of t-shirts that they were wearing. And so there'd be an element of these things either getting kind of stolen from them as well, or being lent out and then not receiving back. So they struggled to get the items that supported their gender identity. And then once they got them, there was risks of them kind of losing those items as well and then being stolen from them. So there's real impact upon kind of the difficulties, really. So not just whether they had those items, but the kind of the struggles and the barriers that they had to go through just to get some items of clothing. They also talk about kind of access to single showers was a key one, and which is they are entitled to within the policy for kind of safety. And it varied with establishments. So some individuals very much had that access to the single showers from the start that they'd got in there. There was another prisoner, however, that had been within the estate, had been released into the community. When they were in the prison estate initially, they had access to a single shower. They were then released into the community, but recalled. And on their recall, they then had to go through the referral process again. So they had to apply to have access to a single shower. That then had to go through a process to be agreed. And during that time, they were required to shower with other people, or to try and find a time when they knew there'd be less people in the communal showers. So even that kind of, again, those kind of barriers of kind of constantly having to go through to access things which they are actually entitled to within their policies, and that being a real kind of impact, not just to having to fight through these barriers, but an impact of how safe they felt, and the different, they spoke about the different ways that they would go about trying to protect themselves. For example, when having showers, or even if they had a separate shower, how they still felt that they were quite vulnerable and in a vulnerable situation. The third theme that I got was about understanding their interpersonal interactions. So this was about the trans individuals themselves understanding what those interactions look like and how they interact with other people. So not just other prisoners, but the staff as well, and even an understanding of kind of how they interacted with other trans and gender diverse prisoners and where they kind of felt comfortable within the prison. Some people felt very comfortable within the prison of being able to share exactly who they were, would have good relationships with other trans and gender diverse people that they'd identified with, and would kind of stick up for other people as well. One of the key themes that came out, and I tried to reflect on this slide as well, though, was this sense of why did they have to announce it? Why within these interactions was their gender identity a big thing? So as Arbus kind of said, of why do they have to why do they have to announce it? You know, I didn't have to sit there and tell them that I was straight or I was cisgender. So why do they have to announce that they are trans? And they were trying to kind of understand within themselves, actually, this kind of not wanting to kind of have a label and make a big announcement about it, but also realizing that to be able to access things that they need within prison or that they're entitled to, they needed to have that label. They needed to announce their gender identity. And it was kind of this conflict between those two situations and trying to get their head around this kind of like, I don't have to announce it to people, but if I don't, I can't access. So very much a feeling of everyone should be treated as an individual, which came out from a few of the prisoners, that we all should just be treated as an individual for what we individually need, rather than needing to be put kind of into boxes to then be kind of labelled and given access to things depending on that kind of group box that we fit in, really. And then the last theme was that impact of discrimination. So again, it links very much in, when Kayleigh was talking, I was thinking so much of that was reflected in what participants spoke to me about as well. And from the kind of what can be seen as more kind of, they identified as more minor kind of mishaps with misgendering that they recognise that people did by mistake, and they would kind of accept that, and they'd challenge people and they'd try and change, and they realised that those things would happen, up to being sexually assaulted. And some did speak about how they had been sexually assaulted within the male prison. Not within the female estate, but they had when the trans women had previously been within the male prison estate. And this theme very much looked about the impact of that discrimination rather than specifically about what discrimination they experienced and what kind of abuse they experienced, really. And there is a lot going on in this slide. Kind of, it's hard to pick out some kind of just a few themes really that picked up on this, but I really wanted to show that differing in discrimination and the different things that they would have to kind of put up with to a certain extent, or just be worried that this was going to kind of happen. One participant, Ash in particular, spoke about using self-harm to manage a lot of the pain that they experienced through this discrimination. But what was interesting is it wasn't just about managing the pain that they experienced, but they also used the self-harm to distract staff away from them being vulnerable. So they kind of thought, well, actually, if I've got wounds on my arms, if they're seeing that I've got self-harm, the staff are going to focus on that. What they're not going to focus on is the bruises that I've got over my body from my partner beating me up in my cell. And so they were kind of trying to protect themselves and their partner from being identified that they were a victim of kind of intimate partner violence, essentially within custody, by getting the focus on the harm that they were doing to themselves. So a lot of what I've spoken about within this, the kind of impact of discrimination, when I've put it in my thesis, is around what techniques people kind of had to survive, really. What did they use to be able to survive this? Some very much would stick up for it a lot and would follow all the complaint systems. There was one individual, Avery, who would very much feel they will follow the complaint system. They didn't believe that it would work, but if they continued to do that, they continued to put in complaints, it would be logged, and they'd also log everything with their solicitor. So very much kind of going down the route of, I'm going to formalise it. Yet there was other people which would just want to keep their head down. I'm going to keep my head down, just going to get out of prison, and then it's going to be different in the community. So very different levels of discrimination and very different ways in which they would try and kind of survive that discrimination and that abuse as well. So kind of overall, what I kind of found from this study was I developed a really great insight into the lived experience of people within the women's prison. And what stood out for me more than what I'd read in kind of some of the other research that I'd seen in this area was the very differing views that individuals have, some being incredibly positive about the experiences they've had, some talking about what's not working well and the very negative experiences that they've had. And there was that difference as well was kind of across prisons. So in one prison, one participant would talk about very positive experiences, but other people found it very negative, and it varied kind of between prisons as well. So it wasn't kind of consistent. Healthcare, for example, would be really praised within one prison, but really talked negatively about within another prison. So there's not a consistency across the establishments. As I spoke about before, they would make suggestions for things that could be improved, and those amendments I'm going to put forward to the prison estate. Part of that was about improving staff awareness. Some participants were already starting to do that themselves and coming up with really creative ways that they would themselves kind of educate other staff and other prisoners within the establishment. They wanted to bring in external people as well that would help with that and kind of give this lived experience of people from the community, and how people could kind of support them. Also kind of further research for me, what came out, which I wasn't expecting, was the level of trauma that participants spoke about prior to coming into custody. So I didn't probe into what their life had been like prior to custody. I kind of opened with just asking them to kind of explain to me how they would describe their gender identity, really. And actually from that, quite a few of the participants then really spoke about incredibly traumatic and quite horrific experiences they had within the community or within their families. And I think that's probably an important area of research that I'd like to go into and kind of expand further after my doctorate's done, in terms of looking at kind of what those experiences are, how that impacts on them within custody, but also whether there's any links between those experiences and potentially why they became involved in offending, and what we can do to help support individuals who are experiencing that to kind of break that link and break that pathway that can then potentially be led into getting involved in offending behaviour. So I'm going to feed back kind of these results. My next step is to present back to the prisons that took part, so I can feed back to them about generally overall these kind of conclusions and findings, and the impact particularly that these policies are having, and what amendments can be made from those policies, really. So that's my findings. You'll have access to the slides, which have got a whole load of references on there as well. But yeah, thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you, both of you. Really interesting and loads to think about. We've got a little bit of time for Q&A. So if people want to put their questions in the Q&A boxes, you can type them in there, or if you want to put up your hand, I think I can unmute you and you can pop your camera on and ask the question yourself. So to get started, I'll start with the ones in the chat because they're there. So Emmy has opened up with a nice easy question for both of you. How has your research led you to the conclusion that reform is possible, or that the carceral state itself has deeper problems that reform cannot fix? So Kayleigh, do you want to go first and then Sally?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, I'm an abolitionist. My work was underpinned by abolition feminism throughout my thesis. So I kind of, towards the end of all presentations and talks that I talk about in this, I kind of always add a little bit about what we can do with that data. Because I think it is important, but I also totally recognise the limitations of that, and would argue for a much more kind of radical approach to things. I do think there are it's interesting territory, but I think there are like different types of reform, I suppose. There's reform that can sustain the carceral estate and can promote promote kind of new and improved policies in prisons, or there's reform that's immediate and absolutely needed, that provides people with access to resources and in the meantime, I suppose, would be my answer to that. But yeah, I'll hand over to Sally.
Thanks. Kayleigh and I have had a really interesting conversation about this previously, because we kind of did an essay and conversation together, kind of that linked to this, coming from quite different views. So, as I said, my experience in the prison, and I'm quite optimistic about kind of what the prison can do, and that like the kind of need for the prison, and having worked in one, can really see some benefits of it. But actually from this, and especially doing this research over a time when there was a policy change, and actually the massive impact that then had on individuals. So from starting to do the interviews to ending, policies changed, which then meant trans women who were in the women's estate were actually then being moved back to the male estate, because they didn't have gender recognition certificates, or the different issues that they were then moved back, or because of their type of offending, and the real impact that had on those that were still in the women's estate, and the kind of vulnerability they felt, I guess, in terms of needing to be moved back. So coming back to that, I think when we've got policies that can change so quickly and can change to a certain extent at the whim of what politics says, I think it's really tricky to then kind of think, yes, let's move forward and this is going to reform and we can make it good, because next week there can be a massive change depending on kind of what the government suddenly has a view about, I think. And having this kind of real binary system of our prisons so hinders the ability of trans and gender diverse people to be able to fit somewhere. Like where do they fit within that system? So I think there needs to be a massive change of just that kind of binary system to be able to kind of really move forward with this at all.
Thank you. Brilliant. So Stephen has put a comment in, not a question, but a reflection. I think as a society, it reflects on us how we treat people when they're detained. I think in the media, it's not a group of priority, but I think how people are treated on our watch, so to speak, should be of higher importance and shows our values as a society, which I don't think any of us would disagree with. Thank you. And we have a question from Manisha. She has put, hi, I'm wondering if there have been many instances of trans men preferring to go to a women's prison due to higher risk of sexual assault. Again, I don't know which one of you wants to answer that.
So I actually, within my study, had a higher number of trans men participants than I expected. So I was very much kind of warned that you won't get any trans men that will take part. And I think there was 4 trans men and 3 trans women I actually had. And most of the trans men I think all of the trans men that I spoke to wanted to remain in the prison estate, in the female estate. They didn't want to move to the male estate. One of them mentioned that when they're in the community, if they went forward with their surgery and they fully transitioned, then if they for some reason came back to prison, let's hope they didn't, they would then want to go to the male estate. But it was about that fear of kind of safety and feeling very, very at risk and vulnerable in the female estate, in the male estate, sorry. So there wasn't that inclination for them to kind of want to change or request a move of establishment. I don't know your experience, Kayleigh.
Yeah, I didn't have any trans men in my in that letter writing study, but yeah, it's certainly from kind of anecdotal experiences and other people's studies that they talked about it. It seems quite common that trans men would prefer to stay in the women's estate, with caveats, but yeah.
Lovely, thank you both. And a question from Rachel. Do the prisoners receive any mental health support, or is the priority maintaining safety in line with the policy?
They do. They receive a lot of mental health support. So the policies include the support. So it's not just about management. It's about support that they're offered as well. So there is mental health provisions for them. Again, it will vary depending on the prison in terms of the effectiveness of that, but also how willing the participants or the prisoners are willing to kind of take that up. So it is available in some prisons. It will be available 24/7. In other prisons, they only have mental health. They're kind of 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So your access to it is going to vary. You would have access to mental health nurses more regularly than you'd have access to psychiatrists, for example, who kind of come in and out. I had one individual who refused to access them just because of how not just because, but they've been treated very negatively previously, with a lot of transphobia from mental health within prison, and therefore they now refuse to work with any mental health. So I suppose it's recognizing that impact as well of actually one person's response to somebody, and kind of fits to a reflection that someone made about how we treat people, actually can then impact many years of whether that person will then access the support they need as well.
Kayleigh, anything to add to that?
No, I think Sally's covered that very well.
You're like nodding and agreeing. And Rachel's also added, for prisoners serving long sentences, are they able to continue their transitioning journey, i.e. obtaining GRC, gender affirming surgery, etc.?
Do you want me to go, Kayleigh?
Yeah, you're probably know more about that.
Technically, they should receive exactly the same level of care within prison as they're entitled to within the community. So they can still be on the waiting list to see a gender clinic. They can go to those meetings to see people at the gender clinic as well. So yes, they can carry on with that. Individuals that I've spoken to would choose not to have surgery while in custody, but mostly because of the level of support they feel they wouldn't receive in the aftercare of that. So they don't want to be managing recovering from that surgery within a prison environment with the lack of healthcare that might be there, for example. But a lot of them will start to go through the referral process because the waiting list is so long. Actually, they kind of figure if we start this in custody, then actually we may be further down the line at the point that we're coming up for release or our parole, for example. So everyone that I've kind of spoken to had started on that process and wanted to access the hormones, for example, but were more reluctant to have surgery within custody.
Brilliant, thank you. And has anyone else got any questions to type in the chat or put your hand up? If it's okay, I'd like to squeeze in one little question of my own, abusing my position. Kayleigh, it's for you. It's a methodological question actually about the letter writing, just because I love writing letters anyway, and so I love the idea of it as a research method. But just a bit more information about the process of it. So you gave them research packs, but I'm just interested in how many letters were written. Were they responding to a letter from you, or were they responding to prompts? And also, how did it finish? Like, did you agree a certain number and then because I like writing letters, and I had a friend who I wrote letters to who died, and that feeling of still wanting to write a letter and then that output disappearing. It's a very big question for 4 minutes, so but anything would be interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's such an incredibly interesting method. And there wasn't an awful lot written on it beforehand. So my process was based just off of kind of the few things that were out there. Yeah, I sent a research pack, and the initial research pack included a question sheet, and I had done some autoethnographic work in queer spaces. And I used some of the kind of prompts that I used for my own reflective writing around safety and identity and support as general topic areas to open discussion with participants. But I tried to kind of keep it as open as possible and really allow whatever it was that they might want to talk about kind of lead to the conversation. In terms of the amount of responses, it varied quite dramatically. I had some folk who wrote to me 3 to 4 times, which was probably minimum. And that was expressing interest and then sending then I sent the pack out, and then I got a response, and then I kind of wrote back to clarify some points or expand some points, and also to respond generally. And then they would send something else out. And then typically when I responded at that point, I think 2 of them had then stopped responding, but 3 had continued on for maybe 6+ months, which sounds like a long time, but also some of these letters would take weeks to be received and sent back. So yeah, I think 6 to 8 months was probably the longest, and that was maybe 8 or 9 letters in total received back from them. Really detailed, rich, interesting stuff, but also extremely difficult to end the conversation. There was no kind of natural end, if you like. And I found that really challenging, especially because so much of it was about what support was available. And for them to highlight across 8 letters about the lack of support, and then for me to end that process was, yeah, really, really difficult to navigate. But yeah, and I still think about it a lot. And actually, one participant wrote to me a year later, and just to kind of check in and give me an update, which was really nice. But again, I don't now have ethical approval to be talking to this person in the way that I am. So I'm trying to navigate, like, what role am I playing in this relationship, I suppose. But yeah, very interesting indeed.
Yeah, I feel like we could have a whole other
Yeah.
a whole other webinar on the methodology. I think it's a really interesting one, and like you said, lots of sort of ethical and moral as well kind of implications, I guess. Okay, that's us at time. Thank you so much to both of you for presenting. We really appreciate you giving up your time and sharing everything that you've done there, and thank you so much to everyone who's come along. It's a lovely turnout, and for engaging with your questions and things. So like Claudia said at the beginning, Get in touch if you have any ideas for future webinars, if you would like to present your work, or anything you'd like to see, and let us know if you'd like to be getting the newsletter and the mailing list. We are recording, so there'll be a copy of that available, and also the slides. So I'll be in touch with all of that in the near future. But otherwise, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
I'll see you later.
Again.
Bye.
Bye.